Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Spotlight Talk presented by Historic Beverly. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a first edition copy of A Modest Enquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, which was written by John Hale. We'll take a closer look at the book itself in a little while, but first, we need to understand the time period and historical events that led to the writing of the book. To do that, we're first going to discuss both the history of the Salem witch trials and the author of the book itself, Reverend John Hale. First, we are going to discuss the history of the Salem witch trials. Now, of course, this history is vast and much bigger than we could ever hope to cover in one sitting, so we're just going to do an overview of some of the important aspects. Now, broadly, the Salem witch trials can be defined as a series of examinations and legal proceedings against people accused of witchcraft, which lasted from February of 1692 through May 1693. During this time, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft, and at least 25 people died as a direct result of these events. 19 were executed by hanging, 1 was pressed to death, and 5 died in jail. The outbreak began in Salem Village, which is present-day Danvers, Massachusetts, in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, but soon grew to include Salem Town, which is present-day Salem, Massachusetts, Beverly, Andover, Topsfield, as well as many other towns. It is likely that many factors contributed to tensions within the communities and to a general sense of unease among the residents. So let's set the scene. In 1667, Beverly formally separated from Salem Town. It would appear that Beverly's separation did not sit well with the people of Salem, and from this point forward, Salem Town decided it had allowed too much of its township to be carved off. At one point, the town of Salem encompassed all or part of what is present-day Danvers, Peabody, Marblehead, Middleton, Beverly, Manchester, Wenham, Topsfield, Swampscott, and Salem. So when Salem Village wanted to separate from Salem Town, the General Court of Salem Town strongly opposed. The people of Salem Village argued that it was too far for their men to have to go to partake in the required night watch duties, and it was also a very long distance to travel to go to and from the meeting house, something which was required on a weekly basis. In 1672, Salem Town did finally allow Salem Village to organize their own parish and hire their own minister. It was a small victory, but it did still leave tensions between Salem Town and Salem Village. Although now allowed to hire a minister, Salem Village had trouble retaining one. In the 20 years between when the parish was formed and the initial outbreak of the Salem witch trials, Salem Village went through 4 ministers. The appointment of the 4th minister, Samuel Parris, was fiercely contended by some, while others desired it. This led to severe animosity between the residents of Salem Village. Those who disliked the minister refused to pay his salary and provisions, which greatly angered Reverend Parris. In response, Reverend Parris began to preach fiery sermons from his pulpit, which invoked imagery of the devil and hell. Issues were also arising within the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Since 1629, the government had operated under a royal charter. This charter was revoked in 1684, and the king named Sir Edmund Andros as the governor over the now named Dominion of New England. Author Emerson Baker has emphasized the impact this had, saying it would be hard to overstate the importance of this 1629 charter to the colony or the sense of loss this action brought. The original charter was the source of the colony's freedom and autonomy and established the legal code used in the colonies. The establishment of the Dominion of New England meant that Massachusetts lost its representative government and created space for more religious tolerance, something that was not wanted by the Puritan population of the colony. When Andros was ousted, this left the colony without a charter, so essentially meaning no formal government or legal code. And it was in this lawless environment that the Salem witch trials began. It was not until May of 1692 that the new governor, Governor Phipps, arrived back in the Massachusetts Bay Colony with a new charter. Now, as we had just mentioned, the revocation of the original charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony allowed for increased religious toleration. This in turn led to an increase in religious turmoil within the area. The Puritans who initially settled in the area were wholly focused on creating the religious utopia that they had envisioned from the city upon a hill. But some of the children of these original founders lacked the religious fervor of their parents and had failed to have a personal experience with God where he let them know that they were among his elect and thus destined for salvation in heaven. Because of this, these individuals would attend religious services but were not allowed to join the covenant or become members of the church. This also meant that they were denied the sacraments and that their children could not be baptized. Faced with shrinking church membership and the threat of damnation for their youth, the halfway covenant was developed in 1662. Now, this essentially allowed for those who had not yet undergone a spiritual conversion to become members of the church. As long as they agreed to live by the church's creed, these individuals would be allowed to have their children baptized. Many people saw this as a further deterioration of their Puritanism and refused to allow halfway members into their church. The congregation in Salem Village refused to adopt the covenant, which brought them into conflict with Salem Town's congregation, which had adopted it. The first afflictions began in Salem Village in February 1692, when 9-year-old Betty Paris and her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, the daughter and the niece respectively of Reverend Samuel Paris, began to have fits. A doctor was called, and he could find no physical explanation for their illness. It was then that the local ministers were called to view the girls. Among those was John Hale, who described the girls' behaviors as beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease to affect. According to additional eyewitness accounts, the girls screamed, threw things around the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions. Seen here in this photo are the archaeological remains of the Salem Village parsonage in present-day Danvers, Massachusetts. This is where Betty and Abigail first became afflicted. Soon, other young women in the village began to exhibit similar behaviors, and it was not long before the first arrests were made. And arrested first were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and of course, Tituba, the slave in the Paris household. The three were brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft, and they were interrogated for several days, starting on March 1st, 1692, before being sent to jail. More accusations and arrests continued through the spring, including upstanding community members like Rebecca Nurse, Beverly's Dorcas Hoare, and even former Salem Village minister Reverend George Burroughs. On May 27th of 1692, newly returned Governor William Phipps ordered the establishment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer to begin prosecuting the cases against those in jail. The court convened in Salem Town on June 2nd, with William Stoughton serving as chief magistrate. They heard the case against Bridget Bishop, who was found guilty and executed on June 10th. Trials and executions continued throughout the summer. By the fall of 1692, the initial fervor and support for the trials within the community was waning, and in October, Governor Phipps dissolved the court. In January of 1693, a new court was established to hear the cases against those who remained in jail. Most were found not guilty of the charges of witchcraft, and those who were found guilty were pardoned by Governor Phipps. Now that we have some background on the Salem witch trials, we're going to take a look at John Hale himself. John Hale was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts on June 3rd, 1636, the oldest child of Robert Hale, a blacksmith, and his wife Joanna. He attended Harvard College and graduated in 1657. In 1664, he began preaching in Beverly, what was then known as the Bass River side of Salem. as it was still formerly a part of Salem. Now seen here is John Hale's house, which he lived in from 1694 until his death, and unfortunately no known image of John Hale exists today. In 1667, when Beverly formally separated from Salem, Hale was ordained as the first minister of the parish church on September 20th. He would remain the minister of Beverly until his death. He married his first wife, Rebecca Bailey, on December 15th, 1664, and they had 2 children, Rebecca and Robert. Rebecca died in 1683, and John married his second wife, Sarah Noyes, in 1684. Sarah was the daughter of Reverend James Noyes of Newbury and was also the cousin of the Salem assistant minister, Nicholas Noyes. They had 4 children, and Sarah died on May 20th, 1697. And John Hale married his third and final wife, Elizabeth Clark, who was a widow from Newbury, in 1698. The final marriage produced no children, and John Hale died only 2 years later on March 15, 1700, at age 63. In the days before his death, he had been visiting some property he owned in Charlestown and caught a bad cold. John Hale is buried here in Beverly in the Abbott Street Cemetery in the Hale family plot. He is buried there alongside his first 2 wives, some of his children, and additional descendants. Hale and his family members were actually disinterred in the 1860s when Abbott Street was laid through the middle of the cemetery, directly over where the Hale family once lay. While awaiting reburial in the cemetery, John Hale's body was actually displayed at the church where he once preached to his congregation. Both in his childhood and during his time as a minister, John Hale had experiences with witchcraft. In 1648, a 12-year-old John Hale witnessed the first execution of a convicted witch in Massachusetts. Margaret Jones of Charlestown was hanged as a witch in 1648, and John Hale's eyewitness account of the event is one of only 2 surviving primary sources related to the incident. As a minister in Beverly, John Hale played a role when the witch trials broke out in neighboring Salem. As we mentioned, when Betty Parris and Abigail Williams first began showing signs of affliction, John Hale, being a senior minister to Salem Parish, was called to observe the girls and agreed with the others that they were being afflicted by witches. Throughout the trials, John Hale continued to support the accusers and the court and was present at the examinations and trials for many of the accused. And notable was his relationship with accused witch Dorcas Hoare, also of Beverly. Now, Dorcas was a bit of an unsavory character in Beverly. She had a reputation for fortune-telling and had been involved in the theft ring that stole various goods from Beverly residents, including Roger Conant and John Hale himself. Dorcas was also practically a neighbor of John Hale, and her home was demolished in the early 1900s, stood where Central Cemetery today stands in Beverly. When she was accused and arrested in 1692, it really didn't come as a surprise to anyone. For the most part, Dorcas's path was very similar to others who were accused. Despite maintaining her innocence, she was arrested, examined, tried, and convicted. However, on September 21st, just a day before she was scheduled to be executed, Dorcas confessed to the charges against her. John Hale, among other ministers, submitted a request to the court to stay Dorcas's execution for 1 month to allow her the chance to pray for her soul. They may have also hoped that allowing the stay would convince other jailed witches to confess. As we had mentioned previously, support for the trials began to wane as the accusations and executions continued throughout summer and into the fall. John Hale became even more personally involved in the trials on November 17, 1692, when 17-year-old Mary Herrick accused Hale's second wife, Sarah, of afflicting her. Despite the accusation, Sarah was never charged or arrested. She was considered a very virtuous and pious member of the community, and her status as the daughter, cousin, and wife of various local ministers helped bolster that image. It has been suggested by later scholars that Sarah's accusation really helped turn public opinion to end the prosecutions and spurred John Hale's willingness to support the trials and also encouraged him to write his post-trial book. However, it is important to note, as we previously mentioned, the support for the trials and accusations and executions had been waning prior to Sarah's accusation. We're now going to take a look at a copy of A Modest Enquiry that is in the Historic Beverly collection. In total, the book is about 176 pages long and is comprised of 2 prefaces and 18 total chapters. It was initially printed in 1702 and was reprinted in 1771 and again in 1973. A very concise summary of John Hale's argument would be that Satan had tricked the Puritans and thus excused the judges, witnesses, and himself from complete blame, but did make a plea for forgiveness. We are going to take a look at some of the pages from the book, and I just want to remind everyone that spelling and grammar have changed since the 16th century, so you will see a variety of spellings as well as the long F used to spell words that begin with an S. It should also be noted that John Hale refers to individuals by their initials throughout the work. For example, you'll see Dorcas Hoare mentioned as D.H. The first preface was written by John Higginson, the pastor of the Church of Salem, and is dated March 23, 1697. In this preface, Higginson explains that when the afflictions and trials began, he thought they were going to be over fairly quickly and was surprised when they continued and escalated. In this preface, Higginson states, "But the Lord was pleased suddenly to put a stop to those proceedings, that there was no further trouble, but it left in the minds of men a sad remembrance of that sorrowful time, and a doubt whether some innocent persons might not suffer and some guilty persons escape. There is no doubt but the judges and juries proceeded in their integrity, with a zeal of God against sin, according to their best light, and according to law and evidence. But there is a question yet unresolved, whether some of the laws, customs, and principles used by the judges and juries in the trials of witches in England, which were followed as patterns here, were not insufficient and unsafe." So what he's essentially saying there is that many of those involved in and who were witnesses to the trial know that something probably went wrong, and it's likely some innocent parties were condemned and that some guilty parties escaped. He also states here that the judges and juries did everything right in following the laws that they had before them. Higginson does say that the laws they followed were likely faulty and insufficient and unsafe, but since all they did was follow the model of British law, they could hardly be to blame. Higginson then goes on to argue that Reverend John Hale was frequently present and a diligent observer of all that passed at the trials, essentially saying that Hale was there for the trials and thus an appropriate person to be writing this account. Higginson goes on to further argue that Hale has written this book in such a pious and modest manner as cannot be offensive to any, but may be generally acceptable to all the lovers of truth and peace. So what he's saying there is that Hale has produced a book about the trials in the best possible manner, and one in such way that none should be offended by it. Higginson also makes the argument that the book is necessary, so that whatever mistakes we fell into in the dark hour of temptation that was upon us, may be, upon more light, so discovered, acknowledged and disowned by us, as that it may be a matter of warning and caution to those that come after us, that they may not fall into the like, and that it may occasion the most learned and pious men to make a fuller inquiry into the matter of witchcraft, especially into the positive part, how witches may be so discovered that innocent persons may be preserved, and none but the guilty suffer. And there, of course, he is saying it's important that we do learn how to uncover witches in the best manner possible, so that we only can uncover who are witches and not condemn those who are not. As we can see, Higginson's preface is really meant to serve multiple purposes. As a senior minister, his words would typically be taken as reliable. Thus, when he says that John Hale is the best person to write this book because he is well intentioned and was also present for a majority of the trials, we should believe him. He also argues that it's important to write this book because it may help future generations determine how to positively identify witches without implicating innocent parties. Now John Hale also wrote a preface dated December 15th, 1697. He remarks that it is his duty to undertake the task of searching out answers to the Satan's mysteries of witchcraft as a learned and holy man. He also says, letting loose upon us the devil in 1691 and 92, as we never experienced before, and therefore apprehending and condemning persons for witchcraft, and nextly acquitting others no less liable to such a charge, which evidently show why we were in the dark and knew not what to do. Now this is a major theme for John Hale throughout the book, essentially saying we had no guidance in this. We were in the dark and we were lost. We didn't know what we were doing at the time. We didn't know that what we were doing was wrong, and we didn't know how to handle it. He also says, I have waited 5 years for some other person to undertake it, who might do it better than I can, but can none find and judge it better do what I can than that such a work should be left undone. Better sincerely, though weakly done, than not at all. Here he is essentially stating that since no one else has come forward to write such a book about the trials, he feels he must do it, and that it would be better for posterity's sake to have his version of the events than none at all. He also reiterates that he was present for a majority of the examinations and trials. In Chapter 1, Hale mentions several other witchcraft cases in New England beginning in 1646. He says it's not his place to tell a full history of these events, but lists enough to let us know that witchcraft accusations were not unheard of. He also says he brings these up to show that there were 5 common characteristics that these cases showed when dealing with witches. 1 was that the devil cannot assume the shape of an innocent person. 2 was that at least 2 witnesses were required to witness an act of witchcraft before it would be considered a crime. 3, that there was a presumption of guilt against those individuals who had devil's marks. 4, if a bewitched object was burnt, the supposed witch would be drawn to that fire. And 5, if after anger between neighbors then mischief followed, suspicion of witchcraft was often bred. Now John Hale also discusses how the outbreak started in Reverend Parris's house amongst his daughter and niece, and that the ultimate accusations against Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good stemmed from that. Hale remarks that Tituba was a very credible witness in their minds. She always gave the same answers to their questions, which they took to be a sign that she was telling the truth, because it would have been very difficult for a liar to keep their story straight. In this excerpt, we see John Hale discussing Dorcas Hoare, as I mentioned, she'd be referred to as D.H., confessing to the practice of witchcraft. Throughout the book, he continues to tell the story of the events of the trial and states that Satan, and not the people of Salem themselves, were responsible for the events. Hale tries to convince the reader that the inhabitants were placed under Satan's yoke, and thus therefore turned to witchcraft. Though Hale blames Satan, he also brings God into the matter. He believed that people, though under Satan, were still able to pray to God to get them out of their predicament. Hale says that by finally answering their prayers in times of difficulty, on page 167, God was able to pull Salem and its people out of the trials. Here we see an excerpt again featuring Dorcas Hoare. In this section, John Hale discusses how Dorcas Hoare signed the Devil's Book because she was overcome by the extremity of her pains, and upon signing the book, her suffering was alleviated. Now, perhaps one of the most well-known phrases from the book comes near the very end. Hale ends his book with a plea, which reads, "Such was the darkness of that day, the tortures and lamentations of the afflicted, and the power of former precedents, that we walked in the clouds and could not see our way. And we have had much cause to be humbled for error on that hand, which cannot be retrieved. So that we must beseech the Lord, that if any innocent blood hath been shed in the hour of temptation, the Lord will not lay it to our charge, but be merciful to his people, who he hath redeemed, and that on that day, when he shall visit, he will not visit this upon our land, but blot it out, and wash it away with the blood of Jesus Christ. Hale did not believe that there were evildoers in Salem. Rather, good and well-intentioned people had made horrible mistakes. He suggests that the officials and judges had been so afraid of the threat of witchcraft, and with the lack of a legal system, they panicked, and these serious errors resulted in the loss of innocent lives. This book is an important piece of American history, not only because it's a first-hand account of the trials by someone who was present at them and was trying to find out what went wrong, but also because it was published despite there being a government ban on any and all publications relating to the events that occurred in Salem. Immediately following the Salem witch trials, Governor William Phips instituted a publication ban on any and all accounts of the trials. In reporting on the events of the Salem witch trials to his superiors in England, Phips wrote, "I have also put a stop to the printing of any discourses one way or the other that may increase the needless disputes of people upon this occasion, because I saw a likelihood of kindling an indistinguishable flame." Phips spun the ban to those in England as a means of quashing a potential resurgence of the trials, but in reality he was preventing those who had witnessed the trials from telling the story of the awful mistakes that had been allowed to take place. The only book on the matter that was not subject to this ban was Cotton Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World. Seen here is an image of Cotton Mather, as well as an excerpt from John Hale's book, where we can see he mentions that book, Invisible Wonders, near the bottom of the page. Now, this book escaped censorship and gained the government's endorsement because it spun the events in a way that protected the new Phips administration from any wrongdoing. The Phips administration, as we mentioned previously, was new, and it was a fragile government, and it really could not afford public acknowledgement that the judicial system had wrongly executed and imprisoned innocent people. Such an acknowledgement could threaten the stability of the whole government. However, the suppression of truth by Phips and Mather marked a turning point in American history. The trials and the aftermath resulted in disagreement on many levels within the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the most glaring of which was that it perhaps created a lasting animosity between the governor and the Massachusetts legislature. The legislature would never again trust a royal governor, a fact which ultimately, as we know, resulted in revolution. Some individuals, such as Thomas Maule, did try to skirt the publication ban by publishing outside of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Maule published in New York, and his book, Truth Held Forth and Maintained, was sharply critical of the Phips government and condemned the trials. But despite publishing in New York, Maule was arrested and jailed for 12 months, and his book was subject to mass seizure and burnings. Now, A Modest Enquiry was published in 1702 in the midst of this publication ban. However, John Hale, who had died 2 years earlier in 1700, could obviously not face any consequences for its publication. It's also important to note the effect this publication ban had on restoring innocence. While there were some public acts of contrition, including Judge Samuel Sewall's apology in 1697, as well as a 1711 reversal of attainder, these did nothing to alleviate the suffering of those directly affected. Dozens of petitions were submitted to the government asking for restoration of seized property, reimbursement for damages, and restoration of innocence for the victims of 1692. Despite all of this, it was not until 2001 that the final 5 witches were fully exonerated. Now, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about John Hale, I highly encourage you to visit the home where he wrote A Modest Enquiry, Hale Farm, which is owned and cared for by Historic Beverly and is open seasonally to the public. So thank you so much for attending today's Spotlight Talk. If you enjoyed this talk, please support future programming by using Text to Give and text HISTBEV to the number 443-21 or become a Historic Beverly at the link on your screen. If you have any questions about anything you saw or heard today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Historic Beverly. And we hope to see you at another program. And we highly encourage you to check out our website, historicbeverly.net. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram as Historic Beverly. And we hope you enjoyed all of our other Spotlight Talks that we have available on our YouTube channel. Thanks again for attending. Bye-bye.